The 1980s gave us some of the wildest horror and exploitation films ever made, but plenty of them never made it to the viewers the way they were intended. These are the films that freaked out the MPAA, sparked public outrage, and got yanked from theaters after only days. A Santa Claus slasher that parents' groups tried to erase, the Grindhouse movie so extreme it actually sent distributors to jail, and a pig-mauling climax so outrageous it was banned for decades. These movies weren't just too violent for the 80s, I think they actually shocked the censors more than the viewers. Savage Streets throws you into a sleazy version of 1980s LA, where Linda Blair plays Brenda, a high schooler who goes full vigilante after her deaf sister is assaulted and her best friend is killed by a local gang. Brenda arms herself with a crossbow and some bear traps and just starts picking the gang members off one by one. The MPAA hated this film. Originally slapped with an X rating, not for sex, but for how violent and sadistic the whole thing was. Even in the R-rated cut, the assault scene is rough. The uncut version went further with way more detail. Same with the revenge. Crossbow through the throat, a guy caught in a bear trap, that brutal final fight, all trimmed just so it could play in theaters. Even with the cuts, it was still too much for a lot of places. Australia outright banned it. The UK had to slash a bunch of scenes just to get it on shelves. Critics trashed the film when it came out. Roger Ebert called it junk and sleaze. Linda Blair even got a Golden Raspberry for Worst Actress. But over the years, Savage Streets developed a hardcore fan base. It's got that nasty edge people look for in 80s exploitation, and the uncut version actually delivers. The assault scene is genuinely harrowing, and the revenge is unrelentingly savage. The story here follows George, a guy just released from a mental hospital after some experimental therapy. Of course, it didn't work. He starts hallucinating, reliving childhood trauma, and eventually snaps, leading to a string of brutal murders. There's a lot of buildup, but once the violence kicks in, it gets really nasty. This movie got slapped with an X rating, again for violence, not sex, and the director refused to censor it. Distributors wouldn't touch it unless they cut the gore, but he stood firm, so it was released unrated, which basically meant grindhouse-only screenings. In the UK, it got caught up in the whole video nasty panic. Nightmare was actually the only film on that list whose distributor went to jail. That's how serious the censorship was around this thing. The kills are graphic, decapitations, children witnessing murders, extended throat slashing, and all done with this sleazy, low-budget grime that makes it feel dirtier than your average slasher. Some people even thought the effects were done by Tom Savini. He was apparently just a friend of the effects director and didn't actually work on the film, but the rumor stuck, because the gore was that good. This film is a bizarre mix of Satanism and early computer technology. Evilspeak stars Clint Howard as Stanley, a bullied military school cadet who finds an old computer that can summon demons. He plugs in some Latin, runs a few programs, and starts channeling a medieval Satanist to get revenge on the classmates who humiliate him. It's slow to get going, but when the horror hits, it goes nuts. The final 20 minutes are an all-out gore fest. Heads flying, bodies slashed, limbs hacked up with a demonic sword, and a woman gets mauled to death by killer pigs. The MPAA gave the original cut a hard time. The version that hit US theaters was trimmed, especially the pig scene and the satanic slaughter at the end. Even toned down, it still felt extreme, and in the UK it got outright banned as a video nasty. They had to cut over 3 minutes just to get it released, and even then it was years before an uncut version came out on DVD and Blu-ray. Once you see the pig scene uncut, you get why censors flipped out. It's nasty. You've probably heard of Cropsy, the urban legend about a burned janitor who comes back to kill kids at summer camp. That's the setup for The Burning, and it takes that simple idea and runs with it straight into some of the best practical gore of the 80s. Tom Savini did the effects, and he went all out. There's this infamous raft scene where Cropsy pops up in the middle of the lake and just goes to town. Fingers chopped off, throat slashed, heads split open. Of course, the MPAA freaked. The original version had to be trimmed down hard. On about a minute of gore was cut just to get it down to an R. That raft massacre got hit the worst. Same with the prostitute murder at the beginning. When it came out, critics hated it. They called it a ripoff of Friday the 13th, and it barely made any money. It took decades for the full version to resurface in the US. In 2007, the uncut print finally hit DVD, and then Scream Factory gave it the full Blu-ray treatment. This is the poster child for 1980s censorship. My Bloody Valentine is a Canadian slasher about a pickaxe-wielding killer in a mining town, and when it was submitted to the MPAA, they basically butchered it. Almost every kill was trimmed or cut entirely. Originally, you had bodies impaled, hearts ripped out, full-on drill impalements, and most of that was completely removed. 9 minutes of footage got chopped. The final theatrical cut was so neutered that viewers barely saw any blood. And this wasn't random. It came during a full-on backlash against slasher films. Studios were being pressured hard after Friday the 13th and John Lennon's murder, so the MPAA cracked down. My Bloody Valentine even got hit with an X rating after it had already been trimmed once. So they had to cut it again. Naturally, horror fans were convinced there was a lost, ultra-violent version out there. And for years, it was basically horror's holy grail. Then in 2009, Lionsgate finally released a DVD and Blu-ray that brought back about 3 minutes of the original gore. You get the full impalements, the heart in a candy box reveal, and more of that infamous double drill kill. A dystopian prison camp, a sadistic human hunting game, and enough gore to make 1982 censors run for cover. This movie does not mess around. One prisoner gets blown up by a landmine in the first act. Another is gunned down by a turret so violently that his limbs are practically liquefied. And then there's a mutant guard with a machete who goes around hacking people's arms off like it's nothing. In Australia, it was banned outright in Queensland. The UK slashed out nearly 4 minutes of gore just to get it into cinemas. And in the US, the distributor had to remove torture scenes and at least one full-body explosion to scrape an R rating. But even after all that trimming, it was still one of the most violent things you could see in theaters at the time. Today, you can finally see it uncut. Severin Films put out a Blu-ray that restores all the missing limbs, splattered guts, and that glorious rocket launcher kill in full. High school punks stealing drugs, assaulting teachers' wives, and getting chopped up by buzzsaws in shop class. The movie opens like a gritty inner-city drama, but by the end, it's pure, bloody chaos. One kid gets impaled, another gets literally carved up by a table saw. The final 20 minutes are straight-up carnage, and yeah, that got the censors' attention. The MPAA originally gave it an X rating because of violence, especially the gang assault scene and the finale's bloodbath. To get an R, they had to cut almost 4 minutes of brutality, and in the UK they went even harder. The film was rejected outright in 1982 and only appeared years later in heavily edited form. But make no mistake, this movie wanted to be controversial. Alice Cooper did the title song, and Michael J. Fox, before Back to the Future, plays a kid who gets stabbed for trying to do the right thing. This one didn't just get censored, it got pulled from theaters. Not because of gore, although there's plenty, but because the killer wears a Santa suit. Billy witnesses his parents get murdered by a criminal in a Santa costume. Years later, he snaps, dresses up as Santa, and starts killing people for being naughty. One woman gets impaled on a pair of mounted deer antlers. Another guy's beheaded while sledding. The kills are graphic, but what really sent people into a frenzy was the timing. It came out in November, right before Christmas. Parents lost their minds. Protests, boycotts, theaters pulling the movie within a week of release. Even Siskel and Ebert went on air to shame the filmmakers by name. And yeah, the MPAA forced some cuts too. 4 scenes had a few seconds of gore snipped to get an R. But the bigger censorship was moral. The idea of a killer Santa was enough to get this thing shut down. It took decades before the full unrated version was widely available. Scream Factory finally put it out on Blu-ray with all the missing gore edited back in, including the antler impalement in full with blood dripping down the Christmas lights. You even get a tiny collectible ornament of Billy in the Santa suit. It's kind of poetic, actually. The movie that got banned for ruining Christmas is now a cult holiday tradition. Here's the thing with Henry. It's not flashy. It's not filled with fountains of blood, but it still got hit with an X rating. Not for what it shows, but for the tone. The MPAA couldn't point to one scene. They said the whole thing was just morally unacceptable. The film follows a guy loosely based on real-life serial killer Henry Lee Lucas. He kills people at random with no pattern and no motive. There's a home invasion sequence where you watch the aftermath on VHS tape, with Henry and Otis rewinding it like a slasher highlight reel. It's deeply unsettling, and that's exactly what made the MPAA shut it down. There was no edited version. The director refused to cut anything, so the film just sat on a shelf for 4 years, only screened at festivals. When it finally came out in 1990, it was in an unrated version because no studio wanted to release something the MPAA had basically blacklisted. There's no theatrical cut or some censored cut here. Henry was basically born banned, and the version you watch today is the exact same one that freaked everyone out in the late 80s. If you thought Reanimator was gory, Stuart Gordon came back with From Beyond and made it even grosser. This one's all about body horror, and it doesn't hold back. A machine opens a portal to another dimension and people start mutating. Dr. Pretorius, the guy who turns it on, gets his head twisted off and comes back as a sex-crazed slime monster. At one point, a guy's eye gets bitten out of his skull. Later, someone's face melts under a swarm of alien bugs. Naturally, the MPAA had a field day. To avoid the X rating, Gordon had to cut around 2 full minutes, mostly from the most disgusting stuff. The eyeball-munching scene was trimmed, and the kinky sadomasochistic sequence with Barbara Crampton in leather was cut short, and most of Pretorius's gross-out transformation got chopped for being way too sexual and grotesque at once. For years, only the R-rated version was available. Fans knew it had been hacked up. The editing was weird, scenes felt incomplete, but in 2007 the missing footage was finally recovered and we got the unrated director's cut on DVD.